I'm Jim Check. You're watching Kelowna Now. I've got with me MP John Rustad, the leader of the Conservative Party of BC. Thank you for joining me today, John.
Thank you for having me on.
So we got some terrible news on Friday. Canfor had a release out there. They put out there on that they're going to close the Polar sawmill in Bear Lake. And they're going to shut a production line on the Northwood Pulp Mill, and they're going to suspend the planned investment in Houston. Now, these closures and that are very close to some of them are actually affect your riding as well.
Yeah, this is really tragic news. It's tragic for the workers, for their families, and for the communities. When workers lose jobs, they're not going to be around. They're going to have to go find work somewhere else. So you lose your baseball coaches, you lose your hockey coaches, you lose your volunteers, right? And you lose, not to mention the spin-off, the people working, supporting the forest sector. So, this is devastating news. And quite frankly, it doesn't need to happen. This government's approach has created all kinds of chaos in the forest sector.
It seems like for sure that the Canfor statement came out saying they're not getting enough allowable timber. And then the BC government came out and said it's because they don't want to ride out the commodity cycles. So that seems to be quite the difference of opinion as to why these closures are happening. And this is 600 jobs directly, I guess, and then of course all the spin-off jobs and that. But even more so in those rural communities, and I know this from personal experience, having lived and worked in the sawmill industry, actually worked for Canfor for 10 years. People have invested their whole lives into those communities, and there's not a lot of options for them.
No, that's exactly right, especially a small community like Bear Lake, and the impact of suspending the build in Houston. These communities are very dependent on the forest sector. It's good, devastating news for those communities. Prince George as well. There's obviously a lot of spin-offs that happen in Prince George, plus the jobs itself in Prince George. But the reality is this: the government is saying it's because of the commodity cycle. In my riding alone, 2 million cubic meters a year is not being issued. Permits are not being issued by BC Timber Sales. That's 6 million cubic meters over the last 3 years that hasn't gone out. How do mills operate if they don't have wood? You've got the fact that we just cannot get permits through the process. We've got wood that is trees that are damaged, they're died or dead because of wildfires. We need to get permits. We need to get in there and rehabilitate, clean up the site, utilize that wood to create jobs, and we're not getting permits on them. This is ridiculous by this government, and I can't understand for the life of me why this government is throwing the average everyday worker under the bus because of some other ideology that they have.
Yeah, this is really hits home for especially us in the Okanagan as well. We talk about wildfires, and we've heard from a lot of experts that say one of the best practices is do better forestry management I have a little chart that's up here. I don't know if you'll be able to see it as well. And it's comparison of Finland versus British Columbia. Can you see that, John? Or
I can't, but that's okay.
Yeah, so it shows that the age of our forests is quite a bit older than Finland. They manage their forests better. They're showing their forest age is 50 to 110 years. Ours is 140 years. And then they've had 5 out of 10 years with 0 hectares burned. And we've had 720,000 hectares burned. So you can take that chart down, Jason. But I'm just showing that isn't better forest management by allowing to cut more and grow new growth, help in a whole bunch of different ways because, obviously the forest fires hurt carbon emissions. They also hurt tourism. They hurt, damage people's homes and all kinds of things.
Yeah, there's no question that we need to do a better job in terms of managing on the landscape. People have this idea that, we need to preserve these old forests. Well, the problem is in most of the province, particularly through the interior and in the north, fire has been dominating the landscape for thousands of years. And we got really good at putting out fires, so we allowed our trees to get older than they normally would. And we have not kept up in terms of the cycle that needs to be done for being able to harvest and protect. We've removed fire from the landscape. There's a whole bunch of things that need to change with regards to that. But nothing will work when you have a government that is they don't seem to understand the forest sector. They don't seem to care about the forest sector. They don't care about the workers and the impact. And they're not allowing what actually needs to be happening on the landscape to have good forest management.
I've got some stats here just on the impact of forestry in British Columbia. $17.4 billion of that is to BC's GDP, 100,000 jobs in BC, $9.1 billion in wages, salaries, and benefits, $6.6 billion in government revenue support, healthcare, education, and more. How can there be such a disagreement from one of Canada's leading, or British Columbia is one of British Columbia's leading forestry companies, Canfor, and the BC government as to the reason these people are going to lose their jobs and these communities are going to lose their way of life?
Well, I'm sorry about being political, but what you basically boils down to is David Eby, the premier of this province, and their government is solely focused on environmental votes. They're solely focused on ideology, and they do not care about the economy of this province. They do not care about our forest sector, the backbone of so many communities across this province. And they're willing to sacrifice all of that just to try to get votes in the Lower Mainland. That is not a good government. That is not a government that we need in British Columbia.
Yeah, and I've heard this before too, that people say it seems like the Lower Mainland is the focus, and the people in the Lower Mainland, I mean, like likely they don't really notice that. I mean, they don't know where the trees come from, or the wood that they use comes from. They're kind of oblivious to it, and maybe like that's just because it's so busy down there. But rural BC or interior BC, northern BC, they rely so heavily on the forest industry, and it's one of BC's largest industries, and it seems to take a backseat. Well, it actually seems like a lot of industry takes a backseat to the needs of the Lower Mainland kind of stuff. Even if we look at the vaccine mandates, which are still in effect in British Columbia, the hospitals that get hurt the worst are the ones in the rural communities.
Yes, exactly. And it's, like I say, you have to have a government that is there to fight for all the people in this province, that balances those needs between the Lower Mainland and the rest of the province. And right now, you got a government that doesn't care about it. They have their own ideology that they're following that I think is very destructive. It certainly is going to put British Columbia in a very, very difficult position going forward. I mean, just with the policies they have in place, our GDP by 2030 is expected to shrink to just 0.4%. 0.4% annually, when it should be around 2.5 to 4.5%. And people say, well, those are just numbers. What does that mean? What that means is that our future generations are not going to have jobs. Wage growth will be minimal. Services will be in decline. Taxes will be through the roof. Our credit rating, our deficits are going to be absolutely astronomical. Most people don't even realize we're running larger deficits today than we were during COVID when we locked down the province. It's absolutely insane what this government has done to British Columbia. We desperately need change. Fortunately, we have an election coming up in October.
So you're leading in some polls. What does the Conservative Party of BC do for the forest industry? Like, what is, if you get elected, what is the change that people can expect?
We're going to be putting out a more comprehensive forest policy in the coming months. But in short, there's 3 or 4 things that have to happen. The first thing we have to do is we have to drive down our cost structure. British Columbia is the highest cost producers in North America. We have to be able to be competitive. So we have to bring our cost structure in place. The second thing we need to do is we need to clean up the permitting process so that mills actually get wood, so that these dying trees in a forest can actually be utilized for creating jobs, and we can get those trees or get those forest lands rehabilitated. We actually have to change sort of how we manage on the landscape. Stumpage needs to be changed to a different model. So there's a number of other big things that need to be put in place. But essentially, you actually have to have a government that cares about those jobs in the forest sector. And that's one thing that we'll deliver for British Columbia.
Yeah, I think that if people, again, having worked in that industry for 10 years, people kind of put their whole lives, they are good paying jobs. Like they are, the resource sector and the mining and the forestry pay good, and they take care of their people really well. And again, those who bought homes in those communities, those homes pretty much become like worth a lot less because, like if that industry's gone, it kind of wipes out the whole town.
Well, there's that. So of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, the impact within a community is devastating. You can just look at what happened, for example, in Tumbler Ridge when the coal industry went into recession in the 80s. But and that's of course metallurgical coal. But really, what people need to think about from our forest sector is if we're not going to be using forest products, what are we going to use? Forest products are the most environmentally friendly product that we can even consider using as a society. The benefits that we get from a young, healthy forest, from being able to manage properly on the landscape, far, far outweigh any sort of impacts. And so we really need to be thinking differently about our forest sector. Forestry is the solution to so many problems that people think we have today in our society. And I think that's, one of the things you need in governments. You actually need a government that's going to champion our forest sector, that's going to talk about these things, as opposed to a government that looks at it with disdain and it would be just as happy if it disappeared.
Well, I thank you for your time today, John. We've got a bunch of interviews lined up for this because I think it's such an important issue and it's such an important sector in for British Columbia. And I do feel for those families. And if you're one of those families, you want to reach out to Kelowna Now, we'd love to interview you as well.
Yeah, and when you think about it, most people don't realize that more than 50%, I think it's probably closer to 60% of the jobs in the forest sector are actually in the Lower Mainland. They're actually in that area. And people don't realize that, how much of an impact the forest sector has on our entire economy, not to mention bringing in that first dollar, which is so important for our economy.
Yeah, it affects so many industries, like the same as the mining industry, right? Because it's all the stores that feed off of it, and it's all the suppliers that like there's conveyor belts and all kinds. Go on and on, and motors and engines and
all the supply, all the support, even lawyers and accountants, right? Head offices, lots of administrative jobs, banking, everything connects to our resource sector. And that, our resource sector, quite frankly, is in a crisis right now, as are so many other things in this province because of this government's policies.
Well, again, I thank you for your time this morning, John, and I wish you well, and you have a great day.
Thanks for having me on. I look forward to chatting again in the future.
Awesome. Thank you.